This is Leyndell Royal Capital Gate. It's based on an environment from Elden Ring, and I built this completely in Unreal Engine, and in this video I'm going to be taking you through my full process, my strategy, and some of the pitfalls and challenges I had along the way. Let's get into it. The original inspiration for this project was I was looking for something new to build that would really challenge me, and I had also been playing through Elden Ring myself, and I was so blown away by the environments, the level design, the scale, the beautiful storytelling that was woven into every placement of rock or broken church or cave entrance. Everything felt considered and larger than life. I found it super inspiring, and it made me want to try to build something from the game. I started the process of cataloging each location in Unreal Engine to really choose which one I wanted to build first. I knew that through the process of trying to build one of these locations, I would learn a lot about the masters over there at From Software and their process for how they were able to bring some of these environments to life. It's a time-honored practice to copy an old master. Though I like to do original art myself, sometimes I find that it is really helpful to copy or do a study of some existing artwork that you really are inspired by and look up to. You really will find that through that process you'll learn quite a lot about the anatomy of that artwork, and you'll get a lot of useful things that you can then take back into your own artwork. So I started this process by cataloging each environment and trying to look at the different challenges and pros and cons of doing each one. When I came across the Leyndell Capital Gate environment, the first feeling that I had was fear. This thing is so dense and so complex, and honestly, looking at it at first, I really didn't have any sort of conception of how I would approach building this. A lot of these complex environments, there's a strategy behind it, and I didn't know the strategy. To me, it just looked like such an intricate spider web of details. It was very visually overwhelming. I think that's actually the point of this particular location in Elden Ring. You're coming upon the royal city of Leyndell, and what the environment is trying to communicate to you is this overwhelming sense of scale. Everything is larger than life. There's soaring towers and dense, intricate filigree, feels very royal, and conveys a lot of impact and power. At first I thought, no, I can't really build this environment. This is too complex, this is too detailed. I didn't even know where to start. So I went on and started to continue my process of cataloging the other environments and locations in the game to try to find one that would fit me better. But as I was doing that, this little voice in the back of my head kept pushing me to come back to this environment, not because I actually knew how I would build it, but because it was such a challenge. And sometimes as artists, when there's a project that you feel afraid of or you feel overwhelmed by, a lot of times that's the project that you should be working on and would push you to grow the most. So eventually I came back to this environment and I started to gather images and reference of the location to try to start the process of coming up with a strategy for how I would build it. This brings me to step number 1 in my process, which is always to gather reference. What do I mean by reference exactly? Reference can be anything like images or videos, or if it's a real environment, it could be pictures you took on location, it could be sketches, it could be all the pieces that you would need for reference next to you as you're building your environment. And for me, it played an important role here in starting to dissect and take apart the logic of this environment and how I would actually reconstruct it myself in Unreal Engine. The tool that I usually use to do this is called Pure Ref. I'll drop a link to that tool in the description for this video. I always use this tool because it's just really easy to drag on images here and arrange them to my liking. So I started this process of gathering reference, both from screenshots that I took from my own playthrough, although to be honest, my character's not quite strong enough to run around this environment without dying constantly. So I actually relied on a lot of footage from streamers, and I gotta give a quick shout out to Sweet Johnny Cage, who has some really amazing 4K walkthroughs of this environment on his YouTube channel, so check that out if you're interested. So I would take screenshots from playthroughs and from my own playthroughs, and I started to plaster them across my Pure Ref reference board. As I was looking at these reference images here, I was starting to try to see and look for patterns. This is key because when we have a dense environment like this where there's just so much geometric detail, more often than not, the same structures repeated in creative ways. For example, here on the left side, we can see that it is the same arch repeated across the side of this structure here. And if we look on the left side of the structure, it looks pretty similar. In fact, the arch might be the same. There might be a few adjustments. Maybe there's a few versions of this structure. What we're doing here is just sort of looking for those patterns. So I'm starting to look at these references. I'm starting to see patterns. I'm starting to see, okay, this is repeated over here. The structure is repeated over here. These bigger, larger square structures are repeated in the back here with a few adjustments. I can already start to look at this gate here and see that we have a lot of repeating elements in here as well. So I identified a bunch of these repeating elements, and the next step was to figure out how I was actually going to build those elements themselves. This brings me to my step number 1.5. In this case, I was starting to get a handle on some of these structures here. I could start to see the repeating elements, and I was starting to get a feel for what type of structures I would need to build in order to duplicate them around and build all of these larger structures. But I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to build any of those individual elements. I have a few paths in front of me. One is to custom model each piece and texture it myself, which is a perfectly feasible way to approach this environment. But when I was looking at it and how much time I actually had to work on it, I realized that this wasn't necessarily a viable option for me. I did want to try a different approach, which was to actually take existing scans and 3D models from the Megascans library, chop them up, remix them, combine them like a Lego set, and my theory was that if I could do this, I could maybe build some of these larger structures. The reason for this is because when you actually look at some of these elements here, these columns, these square boxes here, these aren't really new architectural elements. They exist in real life all around us. These columns are Romanesque, I believe, and of course we have columns in the real world. We have these square brick structures. We have some of these arches and decorations that exist on these arches. None of these are completely out of the ordinary of something that you might find on an actual architectural element that might be scanned inside of Unreal Engine's built-in Megascans library. So my theory was that I wanted to try to take those elements and see if I could remix them to build some of these structures. And I decided to start with these two corner elements here. And I didn't really want to move forwards with the project until I could prove that this idea would actually work, because otherwise I didn't actually think I could finish this in the time that I had. So you can see here the corner structure that I started with. It consists of a few different pieces. We have this square structure in the middle that I downloaded straight from Megascans. This is not modified at all. I have these column pieces and the bottoms and tops of those columns. These are all something that exists already in the Megascans library. This piece also existed in the Megascans library. I believe it had a wood material on it to start with, and I just put my standard stone material that I made on this one, and it actually blended pretty well. So I was pretty happy with this. I think it captured this corner element pretty closely, or close enough to a point that I was happy with it as a representation of this piece in the environment. The other structure here that's right next to it, this was a little bit more difficult, and this started to stretch my concept of using these individual pieces, because I had to cut each of these elements off of larger pieces that already existed in the Megascans library. For example, this one here comes from a Roman gravestone. If I drag this in here, this guy here is where that comes from, that squarish decoration that goes around the outside. In order to modify this, I use the modeling tools that are built into Unreal Engine. You access them with this drop down in the top left corner here under modeling. If you don't see this, it probably means you need to enable it as a plugin. So come to here, edit plugins, and type in modeling and enable this modeling tools editor mode. In that editor mode, if we jump into it here, we can see that we have a few mesh adjustment tools here, one of them being the plane cut under the model features here. If I go ahead and click on that, This allows me to use a plane to chop off sections of the 3D model. So I can isolate these different elements. If I hit accept, it will make a new mesh based on this old one with those edges cut off. I would then usually need to jump into the UV editing tools here and open the UV editor here. This would give me the option to actually re-UV this top piece here because it's new, because it didn't exist before. So I will actually go and look for it. It looks like this piece here, and then I can go ahead and position it. Find a good place where the UVs look more correct. If you're not familiar, UVs are the way that the textures of your materials are laid out over the surface of a 3D model. Those UVs can be mapped in a lot of different ways, but think of it like a sweater. A sweater somehow wraps around you as a 3D person, and the way it does that is using cuts and seams that are sewn together. Think of the UV shell around the object as the same thing. We have to make cuts and seams around that 3D object, unwrap that, and that is how we map our textures onto our objects. There's other ways of mapping textures like triplanar projection, but on a sort of basic level, that's what UVs are doing. And it's just something that you have to keep in mind when using this approach, because you're going to be cutting and chopping and creating surfaces that don't necessarily have correct UVs, because these materials that these 3D scans have are very specific to the actual 3D model that they're covering. They're not just blanketed over the object, they're very specific. And so, creating these new holes and cuts and things in the 3D models means you need to do a little bit of UV work. This brings me to step number 2, which is layout. And in this case, I'm using a method for layout called grayboxing. Grayboxing is taking the environment that you want to build and building it completely using very simple shapes. That's cubes, that's cylinders, that's it. That's all you really use. Cubes and cylinders. The purpose of this step is to basically make all the decisions first for how big the environment should be, how far things should be apart, and even the composition, how things look from different angles, to make all of those choices first before you actually have the complicated geometry that you're building that will go in place of these placeholder gray boxes. And first you might wonder, oh, why don't you just skip this step and start building exactly with the complicated geometry that you have? Now this might work in some cases, especially for smaller environments, but there's 3 reasons why you actually wouldn't go ahead and jump to this step right away. Reason number 1 is that you may not actually have the high quality geometry yet. It might be a single artist, it might still be in development, and you don't want to get held back by not having the correct models when actually laying out your environment. It just saves you so much time to be able to really quickly blow through the environment, place everything that needs to be placed, and then all you really have to do and focus on with your brain power is replacing it with the high quality meshes, which brings me to reason number 1. When we're talking about these environments that are really complicated, there's a lot of elements, natural elements, there's trees, there's hills, there's a huge castle, there's stairs. It's a lot to think about and keep in your brain at once. And especially I felt really overwhelmed when I was looking at this environment. I'm like, I don't even know where to start. There's so many elements here. There's trees and grass and there's architectural elements. How do I even approach this? And the way you approach it is by compartmentalizing your steps. And one of those steps is layout, meaning where everything is placed. And by just focusing on that first, before you're ever even worrying about what color the materials are, what the lighting is, what the this and the that, it lets you just focus on placement of things, how far they are apart from each other, how big they are, and you can tackle way more complicated environments by just approaching it with this kind of strategy. And the third reason, which is one that's really important for me in this case, is that I don't actually know how far things are apart. I have my reference images, I have my playthroughs of the game in this environment, but it's actually really difficult to take that and translate it into real world distances. So I don't know exactly how tall these are in relationship to humans. I can look at images in my reference and say, okay, well, these architectural elements here are about a few feet taller than a human, but then like the distance, for example, between this character and the gate in the background, like how many stairs are here exactly, how many feet in depth is this whole stairway up here? That's something that you actually have to figure out, and a little bit through trial and error in this case. So I had to start with grayboxing first for these 3 reasons. Okay, so this is my first stab at grayboxing. This took me about 3 or 4 days, to be honest. And it was really just a lot of repositioning things, placing things in different places, and, you know, zooming the camera around, looking back at the reference to see, okay, does that look like the right distance between things when I view it from that angle? Okay, I think it's kind of looking correct. And something important I used was a little 3D character in my environment to give me scale reference. This is really important because otherwise you're kind of in the dark of how things should be. You need a human or some sort of thing in your level to give you that reference of how big things should be in relationship to other things. Okay, so step number 3 is to start replacing your simplified geometry with your high-res meshes. In some projects, you actually just build the high-res meshes first and then do the process of replacing the gray boxes with them. For me, I kind of did both at the same time, partly because there was a lot of things I hadn't figured out actually about the environment still at this stage. There were architectural elements that I didn't yet know I had to build. I honestly just built what I could and then started at replacing things, and then, you know, when I came to elements I didn't have, come out, build them, come back in. So you can see here I'm starting to lay out the high-res meshes on the gray boxes here in the level. And this is where I started to run into an issue. The issue was I had a lot of little pieces in here. I had, you know, for this arch, this is like 10 different pieces, and it started to get pretty arduous to grab all of those little pieces and duplicate them and move them. But I decided that in order to get this to work, because I'm going to have so many of these elements, I realized that what I needed to do was have nested structures. I needed the small structures to be their own individual chunks. I needed those to be nested in larger structures that themselves could be their own groups and chunks that I could move around and duplicate, and so on. And the best way to achieve this is actually using something called packed level instances. This lets you model a structure inside a level, create an instance of that level, drag that packed instance into your new level, and that will keep all of those structural elements intact inside of your nested level, but you can move it around like a normal asset. So this is an example of one of my arch pieces in. I have all of these individual little pieces inside this level. It's all ready to go. So what I would do is come to that level, right click on it, and choose this option here, new blueprint. What this is going to do is let me choose a location for this to be saved into a new packed level instance actor, which is a blueprint here. Then once that's exported, I can come over here and drag in that blueprint into my level, and you can see it is all considered as one piece inside the level. So I can actually have this best of both worlds while I'm building these individual structures with little pieces, but then packing them into level instances and so on. You can actually build those level instances from your main level here. For example, if I placed a bunch of these pieces of geometry, I can come over here and right click in the outliner, come down to level and choose create packed level actor. Or if I have an existing actor in my level, I can always click on it and come over here to the details panel and choose the edit button. And that is going to actually effectively load that current level and gray everything else out so I can make any adjustments I need to those individual pieces and save it and come back to my existing level and use it as an individual piece. This became a really important strategy for me because as I was layering in the complexity, I needed to create nested packed level actors inside of other packed level actors, and this way I was able to get a lot of detail into larger structures and then move those structures around as individual assets. For example, you can see here I have actually completed my corner structure here, and this whole thing is a packed level actor. So I continued with building elements that I came to, combining them into larger structures, duplicating them, moving them, and you can see here I've started to build not just these corner structures, but I've duplicated them and made slight adjustments to make some of these larger structures here. They're basically the same as this structure down here, just with the railings taken off. So you can see things start to repeat and you start to gain momentum as you have these elements built. So I started to get really excited at this point because I could see the light. I could see it starting to come together. Because up until this point, I did really have my doubts about if I was able to finish this project at all. Now you can see I've started to build up here to these arches, and I'm using these placeholder characters here as my stand-ins for my statues. I even did a very rough little horsey sculpt for just the blobby shape of where the horse statue should end up going when I have it. And this started to actually look really good. Next, it was time to tackle the gate, and the gate was exactly the same process as these structures. By this time, I had really figured out how to approach it by just building smaller structures, making packed level instances of them, and so on. You can see here I've started to build out even further. I've even have these new octagonal towers here. And final step was to get in these walls on either side, which really are just a lot of these architectural elements repeated, like these columns and arches. I just kind of remixed over here, made some adjustments based on my reference, which I always have up next to me to check how they should look, and just building that here. And then once you've found the repeating element, you can go ahead and duplicate it across. So not too difficult. And this brings me to step number 4, which is foliage, set dressing, the stuff that you add to your environment and layer into it to make it feel old and weathered and real and detailed and cinematic. I was really excited to get to this step, but I was also a little overwhelmed at this step too, because I knew there was just a lot of detail in here. So I needed to rely on procedural tools in order to get the density of assets I needed to fill out this ginormous area in front of this castle. Looking at the game environment, I could see that there were a bunch of different layers. There were trees, there were grass on the ground, there was little bushes, and on top of that there's cracks and little pieces of dirt and rock in the general area in front of the castle on the stairs. We also have grass growing in the cracks on the stairs and on top of these square structures on the side. I wanted to make sure I got all those details into this environment, and my hope was that I could take these details and take it a step further, add a second layer of detail to make this environment feel even more realistic and a little bit more like my own take on it. I wanted to really push the realism and the grittiness of the world. I came up with this strategy of using a bunch of different tools together. The first is PCG, which I use to set up the surrounding assets around the level, surrounding the castle, framing it, the grass going off into the distance, and the rocks, basically all the background assets. And then I opted for this super awesome time-saving tool called Dash to fill in the assets in the hero area of the level. And the reason I chose to do this is because Dash has a few really useful tools built into it that I knew I needed in order to get the kind of art-directed foliage that I wanted. For one, they had this awesome vine building tool where you can actually grow vines along structures, which I knew I wanted to use for the actual square structures themselves. It had a very good physics placing toolkit so that I could actually scatter falling leaves across my assets as if they had fallen from trees in the area. And thirdly, it just has some really fast and efficient scattering tools, which I knew would be super useful for filling out the detail. It also has this amazing AI powered content browser, which I also used and was using up until this point to organize my assets and make sure I could find things quickly and add them to my environment. Because something like this environment is going to have like a lot of trees, a lot of bushes and rocks and different things that I'm using. So I wanted to use Dash's AI tagging system to keep track of my assets and make sure I could grab things very quickly and use them. So let's jump back in here, and I want to give you a little bit of a walkthrough of those assets in action. So first, like I said, I wanted to fill out this outer area around the castle. This is just a lot of blank space, and I knew I wanted it to be a blend of trees and grass. In the PCG graph here, I have it set up fairly simply because this is just the background foliage. I didn't need it to be too complicated. If you're not familiar with PCG or how it works, I have a bunch of videos on how to use this to spawn procedural landscapes and foliage through the PCG tool, so definitely check out some of those videos, which I will link below in the description. But for those of you who are initiates to PCG as a tool, I will give you a little tour here of what I'm doing. So I have the landscape data coming in here and surface sampler like normal, and I have 3 different paths here for the points, and those points are getting sampled from one sampler data, and I'm just filtering them and using them in a few different areas. First is to create grass, second is a stream for the trees here, and third is for the rocks. Starting with the grass here, I'm using a particular workflow workflow to create some more natural looking grass clumps, not by just randomly selecting points in a landscape, but using those points as a starting point to spawn clumps from. This mimics the way that grass actually grows in the real world, in that you'll start with a single seed, and the grass will send seeds around it, and it will gradually grow in all directions from that starting seed. So I'm using that same logic to drive the logic for this grass graph inside of the PCG volume to spawn my grass, and it will result in a more natural looking grass spawning. So I'm down here grabbing the surface sampler that is going into a copy points node. The copy points node is getting the target, which is a surface sampler, and the source, which is a create points grid node. Create points grid node is going to create, like I said, a grid of points around a point, and that point it's getting from these starting points from the surface sampler, if that makes sense. This is creating a grid, and then it's moving that grid to wherever there are starting points, which I'm getting in the target here. That's what the copy points is doing. It's getting the data from one direction and combining it with the data from another direction, in this case grid, and the target from the surface sampler. Like I said, I have a video that explains this whole process, which I'll link below, but that's the general idea. I'm starting with position and making clumps around it. Then I'm honestly just doing a bunch of modifications. So I'm making those points spawning around a little bit smaller. With the bounds modifier, I'm using a transform points to add some random translation and rotation to them. And you can see already it's starting to have a natural look to it, because this is kind of how things grow in the natural world. Then I'm getting a distance node, and this distance node is measuring the distance between the point in the surface sampler and all the other points that it just spawned. And so it's creating a gradient here in the density, the black and white value of the point. As you can see, as it gets further away from the center point, it's creating that density. And I'm using that density data that I'm getting with the distance measuring node to use and execute blueprint node, in which I've added the function scale by density. And this allows me, as you can see, to get the points on the outside that are further away from that starting seed to be smaller, and the ones in the middle to be a little larger. Then I use a projection node with the points I'm using plugged into in, and the projection target coming from the get landscape data node. And what this is doing is it's taking those spread of points and reprojecting them down the landscape. Since I'm spawning the grass all around this central area here, I needed a way to cut out the points, because I didn't want them to spawn in this circle area or actually in any of these areas. So I actually used a difference node. When it overlaps with another object, it will cut them out. And so the way I got that object is I'm using a get actor data node to get all the world actors by the tag that I've added, which is the blocking volume. So I've basically made on the circle here, and that sphere has a tag called blocking volume that I added to it, and I'm using that to cut out these points in the center. Then I'm adding another distance node, and this time measuring the distance to those blocking volumes, so that I can use another scale by density node here. Is basically taking the points that are close to those blocking volumes and scaling them down. That way, when the grass kind of seeps over the edge here, and as if it's growing in the cracks over these stones here in the center, I'm able to have it kind of blend down to 0, so that the grass looks like it's starting to grow over the cracks and over the edges of these stone structures, but doesn't go all the way in. So the scale by density lets it kind of blend out around those edges. And now finally I have my grass meshes plugged into the end. So let's actually take a look at what that looks like. And there you go, you have some pretty natural looking spreads of grass. That was honestly the most complicated part of the graph. Down here I have some simpler stuff going on here for the trees. I'm using the exact same setup here to get the data from the blocking volumes where I don't want to spawn trees. Again, the blocking volumes are literally just meshes with the tag blocking volume added, which I'm then getting in this get actor data node, and then using the difference to cut out those points using the difference node. And then I'm just using some noise and density filtering to get the right spread of trees and rocks that I want, which leaves us with a great spread of background, both rocks and trees, to fill out our environment here. So that's the background foliage in the environment and setup. This brings me to my favorite part, which is starting to layer in the detail of all the foliage and distress on all the structures and the vines growing and the little piles of rocks and decals and everything. And the tool that I used for this step is called Dash. If you haven't heard of Dash, it's a super efficient, artist-friendly tool for really quickly building out environments. They have a lot of stuff built in that makes your life a lot easier and quicker. For example, there's a content browser that uses an AI tagging system, which I actually did use on this project to keep my assets organized because I have a lot of them and it's really annoying to sift through all your folders to find what you're looking for. I also use that content browser to bring in assets from other projects without needing to migrate them. Because I had already added them using the Dash library before, I could access them from this project, which is a really cool feature. In this particular phase of the project, what I focused on is Dash's really great scattering and placement tools for environment building. If you'd like to download Dash and use any of these tools yourself in your own projects, you could try Dash out free for 30 days. And there is a link in the description, which also gives you 30% off an entire year. Enjoy. The first one I used here is the decal scattering tool. This is really awesome for me because I have a large area with a lot of structure in it. I have a lot of stone here that all needs like decals for cracks and little piles of dirt and stuff like that. And the cool thing about Dash, which is this tool up here, is that you can very easily just add that in. So all I need to do is literally open the content browser I mentioned that's part of Dash and go to my decals, and I could grab a few of them by shift selecting them, hold down Control and drag them onto one of my surfaces like this ground here. Choose one of the options that Dash gives me, which is scatter here, and it automatically scatters all my decals for me across this surface. I'm talking cracks, I'm talking little piles of dirt here, and I can go in and modify all these properties as well. Like I think I want to make these decals a little bit larger. Come here to the settings that have popped up for me, go to scale properties and increase the scale here to like 300 maybe. Awesome. So I actually use this process to scatter decals all over my level here, which really started to layer in the weathering and the detail that I was looking for. Dash's scattering tools also work with regular meshes, so I was able to use it to scatter little leaves on the surface here, as well as little rocks and grass growing along the edges here. And the cool thing about the scattering tools, like the grass scattering here, is that you're able to scatter it on the surface and then use these railings here, these structures on the side, to mask out where the actual grass should be growing so that it only grows next to these larger structures, and then you can adjust that accordingly to how far the grass should be growing away from those structures. There's lots of different ways of masking in Dash. You can mask from where curves are placed, you can mask from objects, and you can adjust distance and fall off and all that good stuff, as well as layering noise on top of it. It really gives you all the tools you need to get something really natural, which is what I was able to get here. I also spawned a second layer of smaller grass, and this is meant to simulate the fact that those little pieces of grass here are spawning in the little cracks between these stones here. These little smaller grass pieces, just spread them out with a heavy noise cutting them out, so there's just a few of them, and that was able to give that effect. I also use these same tools to scatter rocks around the edges of the castle. Next, I wanted to add vines growing up and around my architectural structures, and Dash has a really great tool for this. Here's one of my columns that I'd like to add vines to. I'm going to open up the Dash Vine tool from the field here by typing in vine. Now I just need to add the meshes that I like the vines to grow on top of. So I'm going to go ahead and select this little mesh down here as my starting point. And then I'm going to go ahead and select these columns up here in the center and go ahead and add them as surfaces. Next, I want to make these vines a little bit thicker, so I'll scroll down to the branches section and go ahead and increase it up to 4 or 5. Now I'll reposition this starting point, and you can see that the vines automatically update, which is really cool. I'll go ahead and add a bark material to the surface. I can also increase or decrease the number of vines being grown through the growth iterations here. If we hit 15, it will not have grown so far. Iterate it further to something like 75. We'll get a very dense growth of vines. I'm going to keep it at 45 for now, maybe 50. We can adjust all kinds of things like gravity on the vines or how easily they grow up or in other directions. Next, I want to add some leaves to the actual vines themselves. So I can scroll down here to the leaves section and expand that. And I just need to add a mesh to grow along these vine structures. I'm going to go back over to the Dash content browser by hitting this button here. And I'll go ahead and type in leaf and I'll drag in one of my leaves here. And with that mesh selected, I'll go ahead and add it as a leaf mesh. And it goes ahead and grows it along the vines here. And can just come over to leaf scale and up that to 2 or 1. And we can also adjust the axis that it is growing along. And I'll switch that to X instead of Y. I can go ahead and add additional leaf meshes if I'd like. And we can always adjust things like the probability of the leaves being spawned here, or density, sway, all kinds of other aspects. So it's a really easy way to grow foliage that's custom and grows directly around your meshes, which, like I said, is something that's really difficult to do otherwise. Next, I wanted to add some larger rock structures surrounding this castle area because I kind of wanted to box you in a little bit so that you couldn't see infinitely into the distance, and the fact that I hadn't built further out. So I wanted to create some larger cliffs surrounding you. So I used another Dash tool where you're able to scatter along a curve, and there's really easy to do. You just come up here to the Dash tool. The way you access every single tool that you need to use inside of Dash is just by typing it in here, which is super easy. So you can just type in curve and use it to draw a curve. There we go. And then you can very easily use the same scattering tools to scatter rocks along that curve, which I went ahead and did on both sides here. Finally, I filled out a few blank areas with additionally hand-placed assets to fill in the gaps. This brought me to step number 5, which is lighting and atmospheric effects. This is a really fun and exciting step because it takes your environment, which is kind of a collection of meshes and textures, and brings it into being a little bit more of a real place with a real feeling and a mood. The actual level in Elden Ring that I'm building this based off of has this beautiful, gloomy, overcast feeling to the lighting, which I knew I wanted to capture. But I also wanted to add a layer of atmospheric effects like floating, billowing fog in the corners to kind of add depth to the level, as well as maybe some falling leaves and different kinds of things like that that would take what the level was in Elden Ring and try to push it a little further and add an extra layer of atmosphere and realism to it. So let's start with lighting. When I first started building this level, I just used the standard Unreal Engine sun and sky system with the standard clouds and atmospheric fog. And when I actually jumped into lighting this more completely, I opted for downloading and using the Ultra Dynamic Sky asset. This is a really, really good lighting setup that you can download and add to your Unreal Engine projects. It's very inexpensive, and for me, it has given me a lot higher quality results than just the built-in sun and sky system inside Unreal Engine. It has a bunch of built-in tools for weather, and it gave me the tools to actually tweak the sky here and give these yellowish clouds and help me achieve this gloomy look that I was going for. And same as the built-in sky in Unreal Engine, you can also use it to change the time of day and try out different lighting scenarios, which definitely wasted a lot more time doing than I probably should have, because it's really fun. It's so cool to actually build your level and then finally get the sun and sky system in there and start playing around with direction of the lighting and figuring out you're actually going to use for your final lighting look. It's a super fun process and I love it. I added the Ultra Dynamic Sky system here, and I only really made a few tweaks to it to really change it stylistically. And if you want to add weather like rain or snowstorms, you can always just add this Ultra Dynamic Weather asset that comes with it. And it even comes with a bunch of presets. So if you wanted to really quickly test out here what it would look like in a blizzard, I can drag that in and it will update for me automatically, which is really, really cool. Next, I wanted to add fog cards to the environment. You might be wondering, well, didn't you already add a fog volume to your level? Why do you also need fog cards? And this really just comes down to art direction. It's kind of a way of making the fog in the level feel more crafted and more intentional and have more shape to it. There's other volumetric ways of doing it with actual volume shapes, but for me, honestly, the most efficient way to do it has just been to use cards. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. You can download assets from the marketplace that are cards like this, or you can make your own, but actually Dash has a built-in fog card tool, which I used for this project, which is really useful. You can access it by just coming back up to the Dash tool here and typing in fog. We can create a fog card here, and if I come and scale it up here, it allows me to place it somewhere in my level here, and then I can probably just like lower the brightness a little bit to help it blend a little better, and I can adjust all sorts of other things about it, like the speed and density of the noise and stuff like that. So I just went ahead and used this to place fog cards all around my level. I'm going to turn them on here, and there you go. You can see automatically it adds quite a lot of depth, which I think is really important in a super enormous environment like this, where it's a castle, but it's just so huge and so much larger than life that in order for you to really feel how far away the bottom of this stair is from all the way up here, these fog cards help really separate some of those layers so you can really see the silhouette of some of these structures better, because the fog is kind of like in between it, and so it helps the environment not feel quite so flat. Next, I wanted to add some Niagara effects for falling leaves here. We have so many beautiful trees on the side here, and I've already gone ahead and used the Dash tools to scatter leaves along the ground here, so I wanted to actually add a particle effect of those leaves falling. So I went ahead and created that using one of the Niagara presets. This is super easy to make. All you need to do is right click in the empty space here and make a new Niagara system, and then you can choose from some of these templates. There's one actually here for blowing particles, which you can go ahead and select as your preset, and then if you open that up, all you need to do to actually make it spawn falling leaves instead of other types of particles is come down here in the particle effect to sprite render, and you can uncheck that, hit the button here, and type in mesh, which will allow you to use a mesh particle instead of a sprite particle. Then I go ahead and fix this issue which happens, and then I can go ahead to this plus button here and add whatever meshes I would like to this simulation. And then it's all about just tweaking gravity and wind forces here until you get the effect that you like. If you would like, I actually have a tutorial video on how to do just this exact effect, which I will link below in this video. All right, and finally, I just did some tweaks here to some of the materials and some of the placement of assets and rocks and things, just to get my final look that I was going for. I also dragged in some statues that I bought from the marketplace for these big statues up here. These smaller statues I actually used from the Megascans library here. But yeah, just added in a few final touches, and then I decided I was done. Look at that. And that is how I built this Elden Ring environment in 5 steps. I feel really proud of this project personally because it was an overwhelming project for me at the beginning. I knew I wanted to build it, but I didn't know how when I started. I hope this is inspiring for you. If you have projects that you're thinking about working on, but you feel afraid or you feel like you don't know where to start or how to go about it, that's probably a sign that that project will really push you to grow as an artist, which is a sign maybe you should be working on it. For me, I know I learned a lot from working on this environment about workflow, about how to blend different tools together, about how to plan and lay out something really big like this, about how to get the kind of complexity that I was looking for into these structures. So I just want to encourage you, if there's projects that you look at and you want to do, but you feel afraid, just go for it. And the key, and I hope that this video illustrates that, is that all you need to do is take that big behemoth of a project and chop it up into smaller, doable chunks. It seems deceptively simple, but when you're staring down the barrel of a new project that you don't know how to do, that's how you attack it. You cut it up into smaller projects and you focus on each of those smaller chunks as you get to them. And that way you can kind of divide and conquer the project and do a lot more probably than you think you are capable of. A special thank you to Dash for sponsoring this video. It was because of them that I was able to honestly spend so much time on it, continue to grow and learn. If you're interested in checking out Dash and some of the tools that I talked about in this video, there is a link in the description for this video which will give you 30% off a full year. I highly recommend it. If you found this video helpful in some way, let me know with a comment or a thumbs up. If you've been learning Unreal Engine and you've been tired of just trying to piece together information from different YouTube videos or different courses, I have something you might be interested in. I just launched something called Asial Art Academy, in which we have a lot more personalized training. I create tutorial videos just for you on your specific questions. We have group coaching calls and a private group and community where you can connect with other people learning Unreal Engine environment art as well and grow your craft. So if you're interested in that, also a link in the description, and I will see you in the next one.